this week say if you don't want to be recorded, do keep your video and audio off. So thank you. We're only a small group, but thanks for joining us for the final proper work session for the Blended Learning Festival. We've got Bob and National Teaching Fellow who's going to talk to us about audio feedback. And on a personal note, it was Amy who turned me on to audio feedback about, must have been 3 or 4 years ago now, and I don't know if she realizes that, and I've used it many times since, and everything she says about it being more effective and easier is true. So take it away, Amy.
That's great, thank you, Stu. I hadn't realised that. I thought you'd done it before we had that team teaching experience together. Okay, so we are recording. Everything will be recorded if you have your video or audio on, but you can use the chat, which won't be part of the recording. It's quite nice to have a smaller group. We did have quite a few in the other session, so hopefully we'll be able to have a bit more of a discussion towards the end of the session. So we are going to have a look at audio feedback. So before I do that, could you just introduce yourselves in the chat, please, and let me know if you have any prior experience of audio feedback or screencast feedback. So I'm interested to know if this is completely new to you or if this is something you've got a little bit of experience with. Then we can make sure that we're pitching it at the right level. So if you could just post in the chat for me, that would be great. That's great, Tom, thank you. Okay, so Cherry, completely new. That's great. It is an introduction, so you're in the right place. Okay, you can see we've got Nikki as well. So welcome, Nikki. We're going to be looking today at, as I said, an introduction to audio feedback. So I'm going to talk you through my process, both for just doing audio feedback, which is the voice on its own, and also for screencast feedback, which is a mix of a kind of video, which gives you the ability to bring up a student's assignment on the screen and then talk through it and make kind of a sort of annotated recording almost. So just before we do that, I've got a quick warm-up activity for us. So if you follow the link that's in the chat, it will take you to a Padlet board, and on that Padlet board are 2 columns. One is written and one is verbal. In the bottom right-hand corner of the Padlet, there's a pink kind of plus sign. If you click on that, it will let you go in and add. And what I'd like you to do is to add words or phrases which for you are specific either to written or verbal. So we'll have 2 columns. We'll be able to do a bit of a compare and contrast for them. So I'll give you a couple of minutes. I'm going to do it quite quickly, so I'll set a timer. Once everyone's in the Padlet, we can have a look and see how we would compare the two as a starting point. That's great. So I can see a couple of people in there already. I'm going to start the timer, and just as much as you can do in a couple of minutes. Ready, steady, go. about another 30 seconds, so if everyone can try and just put a couple more in each column. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Let's have a look at what we've got here. Quite a detailed list. So we've got written down as being quite perhaps articulate, crafted. I like that word, craft. So the idea that you kind of spend some time perhaps revising and tweaking. There's a bit of time to reflect on what you're doing because it's not so kind of immediate, but it is obviously more permanent in terms of being written down. Yeah, it could be translated, absolutely. Although we do also have the ability with our verbal recordings to do subtitling, which wouldn't translate but would help for people with English as a second language. Written can be quite text heavy, absolutely. Could be vague, yeah. People can write in a vague and kind of alienating way when it comes to this, and quite formal. And I think that's something that comes up quite a lot, is the difference between verbal feeling quite casual, quite informal, conversational, and written feeling a bit more formal. So under verbal, we've got stilted, can ramble, waffle, meandering. Yeah, absolutely. It's very easy to kind of go off on a tangent, and certainly to waffle without any sort of predefined structure. Personal and understandable. Okay, so there's kind of pros and cons of both coming through there. The idea that written is articulate and formal, but can also be difficult to understand, and you've got the verbal being personal and casual, but potentially could get a bit kind of waffly as well. So I'm just going to share my slides with you now. And let's have a look at this. So that's an interesting thing to start with in terms of where we are with this understanding of how the mode of feedback, and it is just the mode, it's not necessarily the quality or anything like that, it's the mode of being spoken rather than written down. How does that impact how our students are learning? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of audio and screencast feedback. As I said, the audio is just the recording of the voice, and the screencast is that video element coming in. We're going to have a little look at the evidence base. I'm going to outline and point out where you can do this in the VLE, and then we're going to talk about the discussion, we'll discuss the application of audio feedback to our own settings. So what we're aiming for with the introduction of feedback enhancing practices is that we move feedback from this type of phrasing, which is an actual example that we've had from some of our research into feedback and assessment. And sometimes we see this kind of pattern in feedback as well. And there was a time about a decade ago when something called the feedback sandwich was introduced, and that might mean something to some of you. So the idea that you give some praise for the assignment, then you have some constructive criticism in the middle, and then you follow up with a big, but kind of well done. And the students tell us when we talk to them about their experiences with feedback that they kind of see through that sort of equation for feedback, and it can seem quite formulaic. And they also can tell when it's not personal to their particular essay. So they say, we can see that some things are copied and pasted. Not always, and we do have the option, obviously, in Turnitin to have bank comments, which are really, really useful for common things. But we kind of want to move away from a kind of set structure, or something which can feel impersonal, and voice and video and your face is a good way to do that. So I'm just going to share with you an example now of screencast feedback that I've done on a reflective assignment. It's quite short, but it's just to give you a sense of how it sounds. And what I'd like you to do is to think about the written feedback that you do, and indeed that you may have received on your own work or on journal articles, and think about how this this kind of differs. Okay. Second. Sorry about this, I'm just trying to find the actual window to let me press play. Okay, here we go. Sorry about this, just bear with me a second. It seems to have frozen. Okay, here we go. So the first thing that I do when I give this sort of feedback is read through the assignment, and I make kind of bullet points and jottings. I tend to do that using the comment kind of function in the side, and it kind of prompts me with my feedback. So I do a rough kind of mark, and I decide kind of what kind of grade I'm giving it in terms of, you know, probably 2 marks either side generally, but certainly which band it's in, and that helps to kind of phrase the feedback in that way. I'm sorry, I'm not able to share that at the moment. It seems to just be dragging its heels a little bit, and I've got an egg timer. So I'll stop that and see if we can come back to it a bit later in the talk. Sorry about that. Okay. Went so smoothly last time. Sorry about that. We'll come back to that file. So a bit of background here. So we have feedback in higher education at the moment acting in quite a transmissive way, which is something which is very unique to higher education. In the workplace, feedback is given perhaps in one-to-one meetings, it's given as part of a discussion and as part of a back and forth. But in higher education, we just have this kind of delivery of feedback. And we're going to think a little bit about how the use of our voice and the use of video can perhaps elicit a response from students about their feedback. So we want to think about the quality of the message and also the quality of the interaction around feedback. We also have feedback, as I say, as kind of transmissive monologue, which is trying to do really what we need to do through dialogue, which is that kind of gold standard of feedback, which would be perhaps a personal tutorial where you're sat socially distanced from the student and perhaps talking through their assignment. And the students are very passive in the current model as well. So these are kind of things to kind of think about. So we have this sort of misunderstanding between students and teachers, and this has come out of the, as I say, the research that we've done into assessment and feedback with our tester programme. So there's kind of a mix of students not always being clear about expectations or about the assignment criteria, about how they're going to be marked. And then the teacher thinking, well, the lecturer thinking, well, they haven't really answered the question. So we've got this kind of, in cases, this kind of misalignment of expectations. So what we're aiming for is feedback that is personal, that helps the students to internalise the standards, and by that I mean they would understand if they were consistently getting kind of mid-60 marks, they would understand the difference between the standard work they're doing and the standard of work they need to do to move up perhaps into that 70s band, into that first band. So something that's relational to you. to them in particular. And it's also about helping students to know how to close the gap between their current and their desired performance. And that comes down to actions. So feedback which gives students very clear actions to take away. We mentioned feed forward as a way to do that. So feedback that is applicable to the next assignment, and feedback that makes an impact, feedback that is memorable. So I'm going to just touch on some of the more recent kind of research that's coming through about the way feedback is received by students and how the cognition process around feedback happens. And then you'll see how this links into some of the things that we were saying about the difference between voice and the difference between written feedback. So it goes without saying that if the students don't remember their feedback, they aren't able to use it in their future assignments, and then they find it hard to improve in those assessments. So if we take that as kind of a starting point, we want the students to remember their feedback so that they can use it and improve. It's quite straightforward. This is a paper that I would recommend, Robert Nash and Amy Winstone. It's come out of some research at Surrey, and it's kind of groundbreaking in that it did some controlled laboratory studies into students' memory of feedback, depending on the type of comments in the feedback and how they would be categorised. So it was a controlled experiment, it was a large cohort, and they had some really significant results, which I think are interesting when we're thinking about using our voices for feedback. So the students told them after the experiment that they remember the directive feedback over the evaluative feedback. So in the left-hand column, we've got the evaluative comments, which I think when we look at samples of feedback, and certainly I know in some of the written feedback that I've seen and do myself, they are evaluative comments because they are aimed at justifying and explaining the grade. So they might be something like you lack criticality, your writing lacks focus if it was negative. And obviously there are positive evaluative comments as well. Your referencing is good, your structure is good. But the students tell us that they remember and they get the most use out of the directive comments, which is kind of the comparison on the right. So instead of saying you lack criticality, the directive version would be next time include an alternative viewpoint from the literature. And for example, if the structure is good, the kind of directive comment would be your second paragraph was particularly strong in terms of its structure. Have a look at this, and next time you come to write, emulate this style. So they have kind of some actions that they can take forward. So the students told the researchers that that was what they remembered more, and that was what was useful to them. And then moving on, they found that they got clear actions to take forward. It helped to close the gap between student and lecturer expectation, and it felt constructive rather than critical. The interesting point is that actually in the controlled setting, where they were shown different examples of feedback and then did a memory test later, they remembered the directive comments more. Sorry, they remember the evaluative comments more, and the researchers attributed that to the kind of impact of these comments on our sense of self. So going back to school, where you can remember the times that you were perhaps told off or chastised or criticised, those have a much more response in the nervous system, in the body, and they link that to perhaps being more memorable. So we can see that through that formal writing style, we may be more likely to alienate students because it comes across as quite impersonal and quite negative in some ways, because it is hard to pick up tone from feedback in the way that you can with a voice. So summary of some of the literature here. So students more interested in receiving feedback that guides them on how to improve. There is evidence previously that information is better encoded in memory when it's connected to future planning, and that things are remembered when there is an action to implement. And I found through some of the research around audio and screencast feedback and some of the analysis of the comments that quite heavily, that directive tone and that kind of positive praise takes centre stage much more than the criticisms. The criticisms come through in a much more constructive way when you are speaking, and much more accessible. So we want to think about the way that we are helping our students to be proactive recipients of feedback. And the use of audio and screencast enables those actions to come through in the style of the feedback that's being delivered. So I'm just going to talk through some of the key findings in the literature over the last sort of 10 years around the impact of audio and screencast feedback. So these are some quotes which I think have been echoed in our research. So it makes the students feel valued, it makes them feel and recognise the effort that's been put into marking as well, which is quite interesting, although it wouldn't necessarily be any different. But for some reason that voice talking through their assignment, maybe hearing the page turn is quite impactful. And in the current setting that we're in higher education, this is all the more important. We just had our student panel, we heard from students about how they want to have a sense of community. They find that really hard to get. They necessarily wouldn't see the face of a lecturer. So certainly hearing a voice is a way to bring that into the curriculum. And this is one of my favourite quotes. And this is with video feedback. So you do have the option, if you're doing a screencast, which is that movie type feedback with the essay scrolling in the background, that you can have your video on to show your face as well. And you can do video feedback in Turnitin, so you can have a kind of a face and show the emotion. It obviously comes through the voice as well, but there's something about that expression and that personalisation that students quite like. So if we acknowledge that personal tutoring is the gold standard of feedback, and it is kind of what we are trying to replicate in terms of that personal experience, it is able, or you're able through the use of audio to bring that conversational tone in. And I normally start mine with, hello. I can use a name if I'm doing a kind of a draft assignment, or if I am doing an assignment and obviously know the student, you can refer them by name. We generally have anonymised marking, but you can still say hello, say I've just finished reading your assignment, I'm going to talk you through some feedback. I normally recommend that the student has a pen and paper with them so that they can make notes of things that they want to action, things that they want to take forward, to kind of help them to remember it as well. So I'm interested in the challenges that you face with the move to audio, potentially from written feedback. What is it that feels perhaps alienating, or perhaps quite daunting about it, or do you feel quite confident with it? So we can move back to the chat at this point. Feel free to chat, or as there's a small group of us, you can unmute yourselves. What are the challenges that you think you might face?
If I don't mind me saying something.
Yes, hi Tom, thank you.
Hello. Obviously, at the moment, I don't actually deliver feedback to any of the sessions I run, but going forward, hopefully I'll be able to help out with certain things like that. But I think from someone like myself, I obviously am not worried by the technology of doing it, which may hinder some people, but I'm a bit of a waffler. How do you kind of square that? Because obviously with written, you can sort of rewrite things, and obviously you can re-record, but you obviously don't want to spend too much time. That the kind of the joy of that is like you say, the natural spontaneity of it. How do you approach it by keeping it together as well, not just like me and speaking for hours?
Yeah, absolutely. I really struggled with that when I started, and I think sometimes I could go sort of 10, 15 minutes of audio feedback, which had become quite waffly, and it's amazing how quickly the minutes race by. the way that worked for me to get the structure in was to do screencast and to highlight and annotate with comments, not necessarily painstakingly, but just reading through and thinking, yeah, definitely want to flag that bit. And then I moved through the pages working at the comments, and just tried to be quite succinct. Another thing that I do is I normally set a timer. So if you can't actually see a timer and what you're recording on, or it's not sort of straight in front of you, I normally keep an eye on, and in fact I do this when I'm recording lectures as well, just keep an eye on my phone in terms of number. But I would say sometimes the students don't mind the waffle. You know, they can skip through, they can come back to various bits. They don't mind that it's a bit informal sometimes. Stuart says he's a fellow waffler and he likes that Moodle assignment is quite brief. Moodle assignment I think is 5 minutes, is that right? Or is Moodle assignments unlimited and Turnitin is 5 minutes?
Yeah, Turnitin is a 3-minute voice comment. With Moodle, you can kind of record as long as you 10 minutes in. At the moment, the Moodle comment chat button is 10 minutes. With Penopto, I think there'll be a more unlimited amount of what you could do. But then, if, like you say, if you're going to go towards annotating something, actually that'll work in a slightly different way anyway than just delivering a single voice.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Nikki, you made a really good point, and it comes up every time. You said they might struggle to come up with positive things to say when there aren't many. In terms of how long this takes and how easy it is, it's very, very difficult to do when you've got a student who's failed, because you do find yourself wanting to be quite specific about what you say, specific about the reasons for the fail, and constructive with the student as well. I still think that the message for that comes better with voice, but certainly I've struggled, and those are the ones that I tend to maybe re-record if you are you know, talking with a student who hasn't necessarily answered the question, or things like that. And the main kind of action that I try to think about when I'm doing those ones that are a bit trickier is really that the student would come and have a tutorial. So everything about what's said is about making them feel confident and not too despairing, that they can come and sit and get some extra feedback. Cherry said, do you find that students expect written to be detailed plus? Okay, so we get this question a lot. It's a really good point. If you're doing audio feedback, you don't need to provide any written feedback. It's the equivalent. So in terms of the QAA, in terms of our external examiners, we mark on the master's program, the apprenticeship program that we teach on. And the thing that the students get is a link to the audio file. Sometimes you might have a matrix that goes alongside that, or a rubric, but it is generally the link to the file, and no need to write anything down. Yes, Tom.
Just to kind of pick up Cherry's point there, which is the apprenticeship that Amy was talking about. I was actually a student on that apprenticeship, and Amy gave me the verbal feedback, and where I struggle sometimes with reading, I wouldn't necessarily read the feedback comments that if Amy had written them, but I sat there and listened because it was more conversational. And although I couldn't jump in and say, "Oh, what do you mean by that?" at times, like Amy said, if I was that worried, I could have booked a tutorial with her and got feedback again in a more personal way. But actually, the feedback she gave me was clear, concise, explained some stuff about my writing, and I didn't feel the need for any written work on top of that. It was definitely like, oh, perfect, thanks very much, and I was able to carry on.
That's great, thank you, Tom. That was an interesting one to do, because obviously we have a professional relationship as well. So Nikki has put, does this audio work for international students? So I'll talk a little bit about Penopto now, which leads on well from that. So we have a new tool, if you haven't already seen it, as part of the festival, which is going to enable the sharing of audio and video content within the VLE in a much more succinct way. So it kind of, let me just find this slide. So this is Penopto. You can have a look at it at penopto.com. And it basically enables you to record either just your voice in your screen, your voice screen in your video, and package that up into some feedback. And the great thing about Penomet is it does automatically caption what is being recorded, and they're very accurate captions that you can even go back in and edit afterwards if you wanted to or you felt inclined to. It's not always necessary because the main kind of gist of the message will be there, but certainly that is going to really help in terms of accessibility as well. So if I go back, thinking about challenges, for the students, they need to find somewhere private to listen to the comments, and that's one of the things that they tell us, you know, they need to find somewhere to go and listen to it. But they are much more likely to listen to an audio file than they would be to perhaps go into Moodle and open a file. We know from our analytics that most students access their grade through our My Portal before they go into the VLE. So they're not necessarily going into the VLE to find their grade where the feedback is. So we have to try and encourage them to go, to listen and to read the feedback. Some students have said that they feel they miss out on the micro comments, so those things where you might highlight grammar or referencing. Actually, we had a really good suggestion in the last session, which was that you may have some generic kind of feedback that's written about certain things. So you may have some which is specifically about structure, referencing, criticality, referencing grammar. And you could sort of cut and paste bits and provide that to the students if they wanted a bit more detail. It's not, I don't think it's necessary. I think that the audio can stand on its own, but there is that ability. The students wanted the opportunity to respond. Sorry, I've got a hungry. All right, it's my cat trying to come in. The students wanted the opportunity to respond, and actually, I found throughout the years of doing this, it's the main instances the students come up and say, "Oh, thanks for the feedback. It was interesting you mentioned this." They come and talk to me about their feedback, which I never really had the written feedback. So, did kind of see a real transition there. So what do you need in order to do this, in order to make the move from written to audio feedback? You don't necessarily need a USB headset. If you want to think about the quality of the audio, it makes a difference. So I would recommend that. Sorry, 1 second. Everything's against me today. Got builders next door. So you don't have to have a headset, but you can. It makes it a better quality, as I said. And you can do this, as I say, through Penomet, which we're going to have by the end of the month. That will make it very, very straightforward. Or you can already do it in Moodle. So this is the Turnitin interface, which you'll be familiar with. And you see where you can write your comments. You've also got the option of a microphone there to record audio, or a video there to record video. Or indeed, you could record it on any other devices as an audio file and just share that file in feedback for the students. So lots of options there. I'd suggest if you're quite new to it and you want something that's perhaps a starter, to use the kind of the quick record button that's there in Turnitin. As I say, Penomet will make it very, very straightforward. So we've got some time now for questions and a bit of a discussion around this. I'm happy to answer any of those. If I just stop sharing my screen again. I'll tell you what, should we try and listen to the example before we go into questions? While we were chatting, I reloaded my media player, so I'm hoping that's going to solve the problem. So I can try and share with you now an example of screencast, and then we can get to the questions. So hopefully this will work.
It's Amy here. I'm just going to give you some screencast feedback on this draft of your application. I've made a few comments throughout and I'll attach the file for you, but my aim with this screencast is just to talk you through the comments so you've got a bit more to go on. So I thought this was a really strong start. I love your writing style. Your tone is really kind of reflective and personal, and I'm getting a really strong sense of your professional identity from the way that you're writing, so keep going with that. That's working really well for you. I've started at this paragraph here because I like the way that you've plonked in some, plonked, that's a great word, isn't it? You've put in some percentages there about your evidence that you're using to support your practice, so that's fantastic. Moving down, I thought we need a bit of work here, so just be careful that every time you give an example of your practice, you're also showing what kind of impact this has had. So you want to be able to say, this is the impact that it had on my colleagues, this is the impact that it had on the students' learning experience as well. And just be wary of making sure you have the examples. So I would advise that you have a look through the piece as a whole and think about where you can add in these examples. So for example, where you've said here about your work with Biz, we just need a bit more detail in there. I've highlighted the bottom of this paragraph because this is where you're getting the kind of the formula, the equation for the evidence right. So for example, you have you've said that you led a session, you've sort of clearly stated the impact of that session, and then you've kind of shown how this has led to things in the future, and that's really important because we need to see that sustained practice and the idea that your practice is going to develop over time. So that's a really good example of what you need to be aiming for throughout. And yeah, again, a really good practice here because you've got in the second paragraph a nice example. So just need.
Okay, so that will give you a sense of just how conversational the feedback is and how specific it is as well when you're using that kind of methodology. So let's have a look at the questions that we've got. Please do feel free to unmute and join in the discussion if you'd like to. So Nikki has said, does this audio work for, oh, we've done that one, international students. Cherry, if you record feedback into Turnitin, can the students download a copy? I think they can, Tom. Yeah, I think they have the option to download that file, so it's not always sort of requiring them to be attached to the Wi-Fi to listen to it. So that is a good kind of option for them as well. Generally, the feedback that we get from students is that they really like it. We did have some instances where you've got kind of a course team that are a little bit split. So you might have some that are really, really pro and others that are quite sceptical. And then you have a bit of a mixed economy with the students. So in that instance, it's quite nice as a team perhaps to take an approach which is kind of consistent for the whole team. So it might be that certain assignments are audio for everybody. I would say if you do have any skeptics and you find that it's actually taking off for you, normally the students will convert that academic by saying to them, oh, so-and-so has been giving us audio feedback, it's really good. Would you be able to do that for our next essay? So sometimes the students kind of do the work for us in that instance. Are there any more questions at all, or anything that anyone wants to focus on in particular?
I'm just about to test the Turnitin to answer that question, because again, something I don't know much about for the audio side of it. But I'm also pulling up this, which I'll put in the chat, which is I did a podcast with Philip Brabazon about delivering audio feedback.
Oh, yes.
So that's in there.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Tom. That's great. Maybe we'll share that along with the slides as well then. We can provide you with training on how to do this. This is obviously this is Tom, who's our TAL trainer, so he would be the person for that. Cherry's just said, you mentioned screencast. Could you explain how it differs from a recording? So the example that I showed you there was a screencast, and the difference is that it also has the recording of whatever's happening on your screen at the same time. So that's where you can actually bring the assignment up and you're kind of narrating your feedback by showing the page. And it is a recording in exactly the same way, but then there is the option to provide kind of narrative just with your voice and without the screen there as well. So hopefully that kind of makes sense for people. There's that's okay, you're welcome, Sherry. There's also opportunities to use this for formative tasks as well. So we had some really good examples of practice that were shared. For example, if you have a formative assignment where the students are able to submit a draft of their essay or some thoughts or a rough plan, obviously it's very time consuming for you to be marking that and marking it twice. So you can provide group feedback to the cohort, and you can do that with audio or video. So you could sample, say, 10% of what was given in and come back with kind of some generic group cohort feedback, which is kind of midway through the teaching block and gives them some things that are really interesting, which they can kind of take forward. So Nikki has asked, do you know if you can draw on the frame if you record video feedback in Penomet? I think that you can annotate and add objects into the video in Penomet. Do you know anything more about that, Tom? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I'm afraid I don't. I haven't done anything with Penomet yet myself, so it's one of those bits where I'd like to say I think you can, from what Sean and stuff was saying yesterday, but I've not used it in anger myself, so I wouldn't, again, like to say definitely now and be wrong. But there will be guidance coming out about all the things that Penomet can do, and again, their support website is really useful. So a good search bar. So if you sort of just search like draw on frame or something, it'll probably bring up that kind of information as well.
Just googling it quick. Yes, it says you can. Yeah, you can embed other videos into it or have somebody annotating over the top. So that is really, really useful, as you say, for kind of using, if you're, I mean, you could be giving feedback on anything then that was a video or an annotation. Certainly for things like production, that would be fantastic as well. Okay. Any last questions? If not, we can wrap up for the afternoon. We're on the home stretch now for the festival. And as I was saying, the recording will be shared on our website alongside the slides. I think we'll add the link in there to Tom's podcast as well. Keep your eyes peeled for Penomet. If you want to know more about that, there was a session delivered earlier in the week by a colleague from Chichester. So there's loads of really good examples of practice in that you might want to have a look at. So Cherry's feeling braver, fantastic. It's uncomfortable to start with, I'm not going to lie, and I personally don't like listening to my voice. And I normally share that the first few times I did the audio feedback, I listened back and realised that I had a kind of a noise that I was making, like a click, which was to sort of emphasise a point, very, very subtle, but I could see in the audio these huge spikes where I was making this strange noise, and I felt like, oh, should I go back and edit those out? But you really don't need it to be perfect, and I think sort of having a go and seeing what your students' reaction are, I would really recommend. So if there aren't any more questions, we will leave it there. If you wanted to grab a cup of tea or coffee and come into our kind of plenary session today, which is tea at 3, we'd love to see you there. There's just going to be a bit of a discussion, follow up from the week, a little bit about active blended learning, Moodle, I think. So do join us in there if you'd like to. And failing that, have a fantastic weekend. Thank you, everybody.